The summer of 1483 in London was marked not by a singular chaotic explosion, but by a slow, suffocating constriction of hope. To understand the incident at the heart of the mystery of the princes in the Tower, one must first dismantle the popular image of a sudden, bloody midnight murder. The reality of their disappearance was far more insidious, a gradual erasure that happened in plain sight while the entire city of London watched, paralyzed by a mixture of confusion and dread. This was not merely a crime of violence, but a crime of bureaucracy, politics, and silence. It began with the architecture itself. In the late 15th century, the Tower of London was not solely the grim prison of popular imagination. It was a royal palace, a fortress, and a place of safety. When 12-year-old Edward V was escorted there in May of 1483, shortly after the death of his father, it was ostensibly to prepare for his coronation. He was the King of England, and the Tower was the traditional starting point for the coronation procession. There was pomp, there was expectation, and there was the guiding hand of his uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who had been named Lord Protector. At this stage, the incident had not yet begun. The boy was visible. He was attended by a retinue. He was the center of the political universe. The atmosphere shifted perceptibly in mid-June. The catalyst was the arrival of the second prince, Richard of Shrewsbury, the Duke of York, was only 9 years old. He had been sheltered in sanctuary at Westminster Abbey with his mother, Elizabeth Woodville, who harbored a deep, instinctive distrust of the Lord Protector. Through intense negotiation and the pressure of the Archbishop of Canterbury, the young boy was extracted from sanctuary. The narrative provided to the public was one of brotherly companionship. It was deemed cruel to let the young King Edward languish in the Tower without a playmate. When the 9-year-old Richard walked out of the abbey and into the care of his uncle, the trap snapped shut, though few heard the click. Once both boys were within the stone walls of the Tower, the visibility of the monarchy began to dim. This is where the investigative eye must focus, on the weeks between late June and early August. We rely heavily on the accounts of Dominic Mancini, an Italian friar who was in London at the time. Mancini was an outsider, not beholden to the Yorkist factions, and his reports back to France serve as a vital, if second-hand, timeline of the erasure. He noted that immediately after the younger brother joined the elder, the boys were withdrawn to the inner apartments of the Tower. The incident was characterized by a systematic stripping away of status. In late June, the coronation was postponed. Then a Sunday sermon at St. Paul's Cross declared that the boys were illegitimate, the product of an invalid marriage between their late father and Elizabeth Woodville. This legal maneuvering, which would eventually be enshrined in the parliamentary act known as Tigellus Regius, transformed Edward and Richard from royalty into bastards. They were no longer king and heir, they were merely the Lord Bastards. With their titles stripped, their utility to the state vanished, and their vulnerability became absolute. This is the point where the narrative moves from political maneuvering to something darker and more claustrophobic. The boys were seen less and less. The Great Chronicle of London, a contemporary source, offers a chilling glimpse into their final days in the public eye. It reports that during the mayoralty of Edmund Shaw, the children were seen shooting at the butts and playing in the garden of the Tower. These were fleeting glimpses of life, 2 children playing with bows and arrows, running on the grass, framed by the gray stone of the White Tower. But as the weeks wore on, these play sessions ceased. Mancini recorded a detail that stands out as particularly haunting. He wrote that the attendants who had waited upon the king were debarred, one by one. The circle of trust was tightened until it strangled them. The boys were moved into increasingly secure and remote parts of the fortress. The bustling household that should have surrounded a young monarch evaporated. They were left with only a single servant to attend them, likely a man named William Slaughter, colloquially known as Black Will, though records here become murky. The most reliable witness to their state of mind during this slow-motion disappearance was their physician, a man named Dr. John Argentine. Argentine was one of the last people to see Edward V alive. In a report relayed by Mancini, Argentine described the young king as being in a state of terrified resignation. The boy, seemingly aware of the political tides turning violently against him, believed that death was imminent. He sought daily absolution for his sins, preparing his soul for an end he could sense coming through the stone walls. This insight changes the texture of the incident. It was not a sudden ambush on sleeping children, but a psychological siege on 2 boys who knew they were being erased. By the time Richard III was crowned in July, the boys had become ghosts in their own home. The windows were barred. The garden was empty. The incident of their vanishing was defined by the lack of information. There was no announcement of illness, no report of an accident, and no declaration of death. They simply ceased to be. The transition from presence to absence was so gradual that the city of London did not know the exact moment to mourn. Whispers began to circulate in the autumn of 1483, in the shadowed alehouses of Southwark and the merchant halls of the city. Men spoke in hushed tones about the fate of Edward's sons. Rumors spread to France that the boys had been done away with. Yet no bodies were produced. This lack of a body is the central anomaly of the incident. If they died of natural causes, as might happen in the disease-ridden summer of London, the new King Richard would have had every reason to display their bodies to prove they were dead and to dispel rumors of foul play. A public funeral would have cemented his rule. The fact that he did not, that he allowed the mystery to fester, suggests a death that could not be explained away, or a disappearance that he could not acknowledge. We must also consider the layout of the tower itself during this window of time. The boys were likely lodged in the garden tower, which would later be renamed the Bloody Tower in reference to their legend. Access to this area was tightly controlled. The constable of the tower, Robert Brackenbury, was a loyalist, but he was a man of honor who reportedly refused to carry out the deed himself. This necessitated the involvement of other agents, men who could slip in and out of the shadows. The investigative trail often points to Sir James Tyrrell, a man who rose rapidly in favor during this period, though his confession came decades later and under torture, rendering it suspect. However, the mechanics of the murder, whether by smothering with pillows, as the legend suggests, or by poison or simple starvation, are secondary to the fact of the disappearance. The true incident was the silence. It was the moment when the heavy oak doors were bolted for the final time, and the daily rituals of food and laundry ceased. It was the complicity of the court, the way the nobility turned their eyes toward the new king and chose to forget the two children locked a few hundred yards away. In the autumn of 1483, a plot to rescue them was hatched by rebels in the south, suggesting that at least some believed they were still alive. But by the time the rebellion began, the cause had shifted. The rebels began to pledge their loyalty to Henry Tudor, a distant claimant in exile. This shift is telltale. It implies that the political class had received intelligence, however informal, that the princes were no longer on the board. They had stopped fighting for Edward V because they believed there was no Edward V left to fight for. The incident is a black hole in history. We have the before, the bright, anxious days of May and June, and we have the after, the dark, rumor-filled winter of 1483. In between lies the silence. The boys did not vanish into thin air. They vanished into the machinery of a coup. They were swallowed by the stone of the tower and the ambition of their protectors. Almost 200 years later, in 1674, workmen demolishing a staircase in the White Tower found a wooden chest containing the bones of two small humans, mixed with the velvet of old rags. They were buried deep, hidden under 10 feet of stone. If these were indeed the princes, it confirms the claustrophobic horror of their final days. But in the summer of 1483, there were no bones, only the empty windows where two faces had once watched the archers practicing on the green. The incident was a vanishing act performed on the world's most prominent stage, a magic trick where the magician never brought the volunteers back, and the audience, terrified and complicit, slowly stopped applauding and looked away. The stone walls of the Tower of London are excellent at keeping secrets, but they are terrible at telling the truth. When we strip away the layers of Tudor propaganda and the dramatic genius of Shakespeare, we are left not with a clear crime scene, but with a series of glaring anomalies that refuse to fit the shape of a simple murder. The accepted history tells us that Richard III, the hunchbacked villain, ordered the deaths of his nephews, 12-year-old Edward V and 9-year-old Richard of Shrewsbury, in the summer of 1483. Yet, when we approach this cold case with the skepticism of an investigator rather than the acceptance of an audience member, the narrative begins to fracture. The silence of the historical record is not empty. It is heavy with contradictions that suggest something far more complex than a midnight smothering. The first, and perhaps most unsettling, anomaly lies in the timing of the silence itself. Dominic Mancini, an Italian visitor to London, who wrote the only contemporary account of the events leading up to Richard's coronation, noted that the princes were seen shooting arrows and playing in the garden of the Tower. Then, he writes, they were seen less and less until they ceased to appear altogether. Mancini did not report a murder. He reported a disappearance and a general atmosphere of dread. But here is the snag. In 1483, there were no bodies displayed. If Richard III was the ruthless pragmatist history paints him to be, the death of the princes would have served a specific political purpose: to secure his throne against rebellions in their name. He would need to prove they were dead. A usurper does not hide the corpses of his rivals. He displays them to crush hope. By keeping their fate ambiguous, Richard allowed rumors to fester, rumors that eventually undermined his own reign. It is a tactical error so severe that it contradicts the intelligence attributed to him by both his friends and enemies. This brings us to the behavior of the boy's mother, Elizabeth Woodville. This woman was no passive observer. She was a political operator of the highest order, a former queen who had spent her life maneuvering through the treachery of the Wars of the Roses. After Richard took the throne, she fled into sanctuary at Westminster Abbey, fearing for her life and the lives of her daughters. The narrative tells us she believed Richard had murdered her sons. Yet, less than a year later, in March of 1484, she did the unthinkable. She came out of sanctuary. She not only reconciled with Richard III, but handed her daughters over to his care and attended his court for Christmas festivities. We must pause and let the weight of that action settle. If Elizabeth Woodville truly believed Richard had slaughtered her 2 young sons, is it conceivable that she would deliver her remaining children into his hands? This is an anomaly that psychological trauma cannot explain away. It suggests a transaction, a piece of knowledge she possessed that history has lost. Did she make a deal with the devil? Or did she know, with a mother's certainty, that her sons were not dead? Her reconciliation implies that she knew they were safe, perhaps spirited away to the continent, and that her truce with Richard was a holding pattern, not a surrender. The dissonance grows louder when we examine the actions of the man who defeated Richard, Henry VII. When Henry Tudor seized the crown at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485, his primary goal was to legitimize his precarious claim to the throne. He went to great lengths to villainize Richard. Yet, in the original Act of Attainder, the legal document accusing Richard of treason and tyranny, there is no mention of the murder of the princes. Henry accused Richard of cruelty and shedding infants, blood in a vague sense. But he never formally charged him with the specific crime of killing Edward and Richard. Why would Henry VII, a man desperate to paint his predecessor as a monster, leave out the most heinous crime of all? The answer may lie in the uncomfortable possibility that Henry did not know where the boys were. If he accused Richard of murder, and the boys subsequently turned up alive, Henry's own claim to the throne, which relied on marrying their sister, Elizabeth of York, would instantly collapse. The survival of the princes was just as dangerous to Henry Tudor as it was to Richard III, perhaps even more so. Henry's behavior throughout his reign was that of a man haunted not by ghosts, but by the living. He spent years obsessed with security, dismantling the support networks of the Yorkist family, acting like a man who constantly expected a rightful heir to walk through the door and demand the crown back. This paranoia was not unfounded, which leads us to the strange saga of the Pretenders. History books dismiss Perkin Warbeck as a deluded boatman's son who impersonated Richard of Shrewsbury, the younger of the princes. But the reaction of the European courts suggests otherwise. Warbeck was recognized as the true heir by the crowned heads of Europe, including the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I, and most crucially, Margaret of Burgundy, the prince's own aunt. Margaret was Richard III's sister. Would she truly have supported a low-born impostor, coached him for years, and funded an invasion of England, knowing he was a fraud? Or did she recognize her nephew? Warbeck bore a striking physical resemblance to Edward IV. When he was finally captured by Henry VII, he was not immediately executed, which was the standard punishment for treason. Instead, he was kept at court, almost as a valued guest, for years. It was only when he tried to escape that Henry finally executed him. This hesitation to kill Warbeck is bizarre if he was merely a fraud. It hints at a deep-seated uncertainty in Henry's mind, a fear that the blood running through Warbeck's veins was royal. If Warbeck was indeed Richard of Shrewsbury. His execution marked the final, delayed death of the princes in the Tower, carried out not by the hunchback uncle, but by the Tudor savior. We must also confront the physical evidence, or rather, the chaotic mess of it. In 1674, workmen digging a staircase in the Tower of London found a wooden chest containing bones. They were immediately proclaimed to be the remains of the princes, and Charles II ordered them interred in a grand urn in Westminster Abbey. This discovery is often cited as the final proof of the murder. However, the forensic reality is far murkier. In 1933, the urn was opened for examination. The scientists of the time, operating with primitive knowledge compared to modern standards, claimed the bones belonged to 2 children of the correct ages. But a closer look at their report reveals massive inconsistencies. The skeleton purported to be Edward V was missing its jawbone. Yet, the jawbone present in the urn was used to estimate age. Even more troubling, the collection of bones included animal bones, fish, chicken, and sheep mixed in with the human remains. This was not a clandestine grave. It was a refuse pile. Furthermore, the workmen in 1674 found the bones 10 feet deep in the ground, under a staircase that had not existed in 1483. The location did not match the few vague rumors of where the bodies had been hidden. Without modern DNA testing or radiocarbon dating, which the Church of England and the Crown have repeatedly refused to authorize, the bones in Westminster Abbey are nothing more than a convenient assumption. They are an anomaly in themselves, a solution forced to fit a problem. There is one final, chilling detail that disrupts the standard timeline. In the summer of 1483, while the boys were supposedly being murdered, royal warrants show that clothing was still being ordered for them. Detailed accounts from the great wardrobe list deliveries of green velvet and satin for the Lord Bastard, the title given to Edward V after his illegitimacy was declared. These orders continued well after the time they were presumed dead. Who orders luxury tailoring for a corpse? The accepted narrative relies on a linear progression: ambition, murder, silence. But the anomalies tell a story of confusion, hesitation, and survival. We see a mother who made peace with the alleged killer. We see a successor who was too afraid to ask where the bodies were. We see a Europe that believed the younger prince had walked free. The gaps in the story are not empty space. They are filled with the uneasy possibility that the princes in the Tower did not die in the dark in 1483. Instead, they may have been moved, separated, and hidden, living out lives under assumed names. Pawns in a game that lasted long after Richard III fell at Bosworth. The tragedy may not be that they died young, but that their identities were stolen, leaving them to vanish into the fog of history, while we have spent 5 centuries mourning an empty room. The true mystery is not who killed them, but why we are so determined to believe they died at all, when every piece of circumstantial evidence screams that the book was never closed. The shadows in the tower are long, but the shadows cast by the surviving records are longer still, hiding truths that we have yet to fully comprehend. Standing in the quiet corners of Westminster Abbey, one finds themselves confronted by a piece of marble that claims to hold the final answer to the most enduring murder mystery in British history. It is an urn designed by Christopher Wren, placed there on the orders of King Charles II. The inscription is confident, asserting in Latin that these are the bones of Edward V and Richard, Duke of York, stifled with pillows by their treacherous uncle, Richard III, and indiscriminately cast away until their discovery in 1674. It looks official. It feels resolved. But as any investigator digging into the cold case of the princes in the tower soon realizes, this urn is not a conclusion. It is merely the first and most frustrating of the dead ends. The story of those bones is a masterclass in forensic contamination and wishful thinking. In the summer of 1674, workmen were demolishing a staircase in the Tower of London, leading to the chapel of St. John. Beneath the foundations, amidst a heap of rubbish and debris, they found a wooden chest containing skeletal remains. The workmen, unconcerned with archaeological preservation, tossed the bones aside. It was only later, when the idea took hold that these might be the lost princes, that the remains were gathered up from the refuse pile. By then, the context was destroyed. Were they found with scraps of velvet, as some claimed, or was that a later embellishment? We cannot know. The bones were interred in the abbey, and for centuries, the book was closed. Then came 1933. In a rare moment of transparency, the urn was opened. The investigation was led by Lawrence Tanner, the archivist of the Abbey, and Professor William Wright, a leading anatomist. Reading their report today is a disquieting experience. It is a document that seemingly strives to fit the physical evidence to the pre-existing narrative. Wright concluded that the bones belonged to 2 children of the correct ages to be the princes. He noted a stain on the facial bones of the elder child, which he suggested could be a blood stain consistent with suffocation. A theory that holds little water in modern forensic science, where such stains are almost usually identified as mold or humic acid. More troubling is what they ignored or could not see. The urn contained a chaotic mixture of animal bones, alongside the human ones, chicken and rabbit bones, remnants of the rubbish heap from which they were plucked. The skeletons were incomplete. The determination of sex was impossible with the technology of the time. and the age estimation was based on dental eruption charts that have since been refined. Tanner and Wright wanted to find the princes, and so they did. But looking at their photographs now, we see only the tragic ambiguity of anonymous remains. They could be the princes. They could also be any two children who died in the tower over its long, bloody history, victims of plague, neglect, or forgotten crimes. They could even be Roman remains from a time before the tower stood. This leads us to the modern investigative wall. With the discovery of Richard III's body in a Leicester car park in 2012, the game changed. We now have the DNA of the Plantagenet line. We have the technology to radiocarbon date the bones in the urn to see if they even belong to the 15th century. We could determine if they are related to Richard III. The science exists to turn this dead end into a breakthrough. Yet the urn remains sealed. The Church of England and the Crown have repeatedly refused requests for exhumation, citing the sanctity of Christian burial and the precedent of not disturbing royal graves for curiosity's sake. It is a concept known as royal peculiar, a legal status that places the abbey outside the jurisdiction of standard bishops, answering only to the sovereign. The refusal is absolute. The truth lies behind a slab of marble, tantalizingly within reach, yet guarded by tradition and protocol. It is a bureaucratic dead end that feels more impenetrable than the stone walls of the tower itself. If the Westminster urn is a frustration, the Windsor lead is a haunting confusion. In 1789, workmen accidentally broke into the vault of Edward IV at St. George's Chapel in Windsor. Next to the king's coffin, they found a collection of other coffins. Two of them contained the bodies of unidentified children. At the time, it was assumed these were George and Mary, two of Edward's children who had died young. But later records suggested George and Mary were buried elsewhere. This sparked a theory that has lingered in the margins of this case for 2 centuries. That perhaps the bodies in the tower were decoys or unrelated dead, and the princes were actually spirited away to Windsor, dying later or being killed and hidden in their father's tomb. Without testing those remains, we are left with another set of anonymous bones and another pathway that fades into the fog of speculation. The dead ends are not limited to physical remains. They extend into the very testimonies that form the bedrock of the history we think we know. The smoking gun of the traditional narrative is the confession of Sir James Tyrrell. In 1502, nearly 20 years after the princes vanished, Tyrrell was facing execution for treason against Henry VII. According to the authorized history written by Thomas More, Tyrrell confessed to organizing the murder, detailing how 2 subordinates smothered the boys with pillows and buried them at the foot of the stairs. It is a neat, cinematic ending. It provides a villain, a method, and a location that matches the 1674 discovery. But when we pull at the threads, the Tyrrell confession unravels. There is no transcript, no written record of this confession was ever produced. A staggering omission for a government that documented everything. The account comes to us secondhand, filtered through Tudor propagandists who had a vested interest in proving that Richard III was a monster and that the princes were definitely dead, securing Henry VII's claim to the throne. Tyrrell was executed swiftly. If he did confess, he took the specifics to the grave. We are left wondering if the confession was a fabrication, a convenient lie pinned on a dying man to close a political loop. It is a narrative dead end, a story that dissolves the moment you ask for proof. Perhaps the most psychological of the dead ends lies in the stories of the survivors. If the princes were not murdered in 1483, where did they go? This question birthed the era of the pretenders, men who claimed to be the escaped Richard, Duke of York. The most famous, Perkin Warbeck, tormented Henry VII for years. Warbeck was not a raving madman. He was articulate, courtly, and bore a striking physical resemblance to Edward IV. He was recognized as the lost prince by the prince's own aunt, Margaret of York, and by several European courts. For an investigator, Warbeck represents a maddening possibility. If he was a fraud, he was the greatest actor in history, maintaining his role under torture and scrutiny. If he was the prince, then the murder never happened, and the mystery is not about a death, but about a life stolen. But Warbeck, too, ended on the scaffold. His confession, likely coerced, stated he was a boatman's son. Was that the truth, or was it the lie forced upon a prince to humiliate him before execution? His death sealed the alternative timeline. We cannot test his DNA. We cannot interrogate him. He is just another ghost, another diverging path that was cut short by the executioner's blade. We are left, ultimately, with the silence of the contemporary chronicles. This is the dead end of information. The Croyland Chronicle, written anonymously by someone with access to the court, speaks of rumors and whispers, of men weeping in the streets, but never confirms a death. The Great Chronicle of London offers no definitive dates. The silence is heavy and suffocating. In the summer of 1483, the princes were seen shooting arrows and playing in the Tower Gardens. Then they were seen only behind bars and windows. Then they were seen no more. There is no entry in a ledger for a funeral, no payment for a burial, no announcement of death by natural causes. Which would have been the smartest political move for Richard if they had died of illness? There is just a cessation of data. It is as if they stepped off the edge of the world. This void is where the investigator struggles the most. We are trained to find the anomaly in the data, but here the anomaly is the lack of data. The dead ends are not just failures of evidence, they are structural. The Tower of London was a machine designed to keep secrets, and it functioned perfectly. Standing back in the Abbey, watching tourists file past the white marble urn, the weight of these dead ends settles in. We have bones that might not be them. We have a confession that might not exist. We have imposters who might have been real. We have a crime scene that was a rubbish heap. The narrative of the princes in the tower is a house of cards built on a foundation of silence. We want the urn to be the answer because the alternative is an eternal, unsettled suspension. We want to believe the puzzle pieces fit, even if we have to jam them together by force, as Tanner and Wright did in 1933. But true investigation requires the discipline to stand before the void and admit that we do not know. The urn is sealed, the vault is closed, and the dead ends, for now, remain exactly that. The point where history stops and the long, cold silence begins. The stone walls of the Tower of London possess a specific kind of acoustic memory. It is not a literal sound, of course, but a heavy, muffling silence that seems to absorb history rather than reflect it. When you stand at the foot of the White Tower, looking up toward the narrow windows of the Bloody Tower, you are searching for a frequency that ceased broadcasting over 500 years ago. This is the lingering signal of Edward V and his brother Richard, the Duke of York. For centuries, the world has operated on the assumption that the signal went dead in the summer of 1483, snuffed out by a pillow or a blade in the dark. But when one approaches the story, not as a tragic play written by Shakespeare, but as a cold case file waiting to be audited, that silence begins to fill with static. There are inconsistencies, anomalies, and physical traces that suggest the transmission did not end quite the way we have been told. The narrative of the princes in the tower is arguably the coldest case in the history of the British Isles. The traditional story is neat, tidy, and horrifying. Richard III, the wicked uncle, seizes the throne and murders his nephews to secure his claim. The boys, aged 12 and 9, vanish from view. They are never seen again. For nearly 200 years, this was a story without a corpse, a murder trial conducted in the court of public opinion without a shred of physical evidence. That changed in 1674. It was then that workmen, tasked with demolishing a staircase leading to the chapel in the White Tower, struck something hard and hollow. 10 feet down, beneath the stone steps, they found a wooden chest containing the jumbled skeletons of 2 children. The location matched rumors that had circulated since the days of Thomas More. It seemed to be the smoking gun. The signal, which had been faint and ghostly, suddenly seemed solid. King Charles II, convinced these were his royal ancestors, ordered them placed in an urn designed by Christopher Wren and interred in the Innocents' Corner of Westminster Abbey. There they sat, sealed in marble, officially identified as the missing princes. However, a signal that seems too clear often warrants suspicion. In 1933, the urn was opened. The investigation was led by Lawrence Tanner, the archivist of the Abbey, and Professor William Wright, a prominent anatomist. Their examination was intended to confirm what history already accepted. But looking back at their report with a modern forensic lens, the clarity dissolves. Wright concluded that the bones belonged to children of the correct ages, noting that the elder child showed signs of a jaw disease, which might have made him too weak to walk at the coronation. He used this pathology to build a narrative of a sickly boy king. Yet the science of 1933 was rudimentary. There was no carbon dating. There was no DNA analysis. Wright determined the sex of the skeletons based on pelvic development, a method now known to be notoriously unreliable in prepubescent children. Furthermore, the urn contained animal bones mixed in with the human remains, a contamination that suggests a careless collection process in 1674. The most unsettled aspect of the 1933 report, however, is what it did not find. There was no trauma, no cracked skulls, no marks of suffocation, no signs of the violence that defined the Tudor propaganda. The boys were simply dead, and even that conclusion is shaky. Modern osteologists who have reviewed the photographs and notes from the Tanner and Wright investigation argue that the skeletons could just as easily be Roman remains or medieval children from a different century entirely, buried in a consecrated place that had been used for hundreds of years. The Church of England, perhaps fearing the disruption of such a consecrated narrative, has repeatedly refused requests to reopen the urn for modern forensic testing. They argue that the boys should be allowed to rest in peace. But as an investigator, one has to ask, whose peace is being protected? The peace of the dead, or the peace of a history book that might be wrong? The refusal to test the DNA against a living matrilineal descendant creates a void where the truth should be. It is a deliberate jamming of the signal. If the bones in the abbey are not the prince's, the frequency shifts dramatically. We must turn our antenna away from the tower and toward the dusty archives of Europe. This is where the signal has recently begun to ping with startling intensity. In the last few years, researchers involved with the Missing Princes Project have unearthed documents that challenge the murder theory entirely. They have found administrative records, safe conducts, and letters that suggest at least one of the boys might have survived. The most compelling anomaly centers on the figure of Perkin Warbeck, History has branded him a pretender, a boatman's son from Tournai, who was tutored to impersonate Richard, the younger prince, in a grand geopolitical hoax. He invaded England, called Richard III's successor Henry VII a usurper, and was eventually captured and executed. The Tudor state machine worked overtime to extract a confession and discredit him. But new archival digs in the Netherlands and Austria are recovering a different frequency. Researchers have discovered records of a Richard, Duke of York, attending meetings and signing documents long after his supposed death. One particularly jarring piece of evidence is a receipt for weapons and funding, signed with a flourish that matches the handwriting of the young prince. Even more unsettling is the behavior of the European courts at the time. Margaret of Burgundy, the aunt of the missing princes, embraced Warbeck as her nephew. History books dismiss this as political maneuvering, a way to destabilize the Tudor throne. But Margaret was a woman of immense standing and personal integrity. Would she truly have tutored a peasant to mock the memory of her own murdered family? Or did she recognize the young man standing before her because he was exactly who he claimed to be? The signal gets stronger when we look at the specific details Warbeck, new details about the layout of the palace, the private habits of the family, and specific physical markers that a boatman's son would have no way of knowing. Under the duress of torture, Warbeck eventually confessed to being an impostor. But confessions extracted on the rack are the least reliable form of evidence. The fact that Henry VII was so terrified of Warbeck, refusing to let him out of his sight for years before finally executing him, suggests the king feared the man was not a fake, but a genuine rival. There is another, fainter frequency broadcasting from the English countryside. The village of Coldridge in Devon houses a church filled with anomalous imagery. Stained glass windows depict a royal figure that looks suspiciously like Edward V. There are Yorkist symbols, specifically the sun in splendor, carved into the woodwork. A man named John Evans, who arrived in the village shortly after the princes vanished, was given the position of park keeper, a role often reserved for gentry. Evans lies buried in the church, and on his tomb is a shield bearing a reversed inscription that, when decoded, reads, "King." Is it possible that the elder prince was not murdered, but hidden in plain sight, stripped of his name and rank, allowed to live out his days in rural obscurity as part of a secret deal to secure the peace? This theory of survival changes the texture of the mystery. It transforms the Tower of London from a murder scene into a departure point. It suggests that the silence of 1483 was not the silence of the grave, but the silence of a conspiracy of survival. It implies that the mother of the princes, Elizabeth Woodville, who eventually came out of sanctuary and made peace with Richard III, did so because she knew her sons were alive, not because she had forgiven their killer. The investigation is currently in a state of high tension. On one side, we have the official narrative, solidified by 500 years of repetition, and a marble urn in Westminster Abbey. On the other, we have a growing pile of circumstantial evidence, archival anomalies, and the stubborn refusal of the pieces to fit the puzzle. We are standing in the interference pattern between two competing realities. Until the urn is opened, or until the DNA is tested, the signal will remain distorted. We are left listening to the echoes. We look at the portrait of the boys in the tower, huddled together in fear, and we see victims. But perhaps we should be looking at the portrait of the man in the Devon-stained glass, or the records of the young man in the Dutch court, and seeing survivors. The mystery of the princes in the tower is not that they vanished. It is that they are still trying to speak to us through the cracks in the masonry and the ink on forgotten parchments, broadcasting a story that we have not yet learned how to hear. The signal is lingering, waiting for the technology, or perhaps the courage, to finally decode it.